Chapter 9, The Crimean War and the Crisis. 1. European Politics. Towards the end of 1853, just as Marx had concluded his fight against democratic emigration illusions and amateur revolutionism with his polemic against Willich, a new period in European politics was opened up by the Crimean War, and it occupied his chief attention in the following few years. His own views on the subject were given chiefly in his contributions to the New York Tribune, although its editors did their best to force him down to the level of ordinary newspaper correspondence. He could say with truth that only in exceptional cases did they succeed. He remained loyal to his principles, and even that work which he was compelled to do in order to earn a living was ennobled in his hands and given a permanent value by being based on laborious studies. Most of these treasures from his pen are still buried, and it will cost a certain amount of trouble to bring them to the surface again. Owing to the fact that the New York Tribune treated his contributions more or less as raw material, flung them into the waste paper basket at its discretion, published them under its own flag, and often, as Marx complained bitterly, published rubbish under his name, it will never be possible to reconstruct the whole of his work for the paper, and very careful examination will be necessary to determine its limits with any degree of accuracy. Indispensable assistance has been offered in this respect only recently with the publication of the Marx-Engels correspondence. For instance, it shows us that the series of articles on revolution and counter-revolution in Germany, whose authorship was credited to Marx for many years, was in fact chiefly written by Engels, and that Engels wrote not only the contributions on military questions, a fact that had been known for a long time, but that he cooperated widely in other respects in Marx's work for the paper. Apart from the series of articles on revolution and counter-revolution in Germany, the articles on the Eastern question which appeared in the New York Tribune have also been collected. Though both with regard to what it contains and what it does not contain, this latter collection is of much more doubtful authenticity than the former, which was after all only credited to the wrong author. But even this critical examination of Marx's work for the New York Tribune would represent only a small part of the labors necessary, because even Marx, although he certainly succeeded in raising the level of journalism tremendously, could not raise it completely above the circumstances in which it had to be written. The greatest brain in the world cannot make new discoveries or give birth to new ideas twice a week, always just in time to catch the regular packet steamer on Tuesdays and Fridays. As Engels has pointed out, it is impossible under such circumstances altogether to avoid pure improvisation on the spur of the moment and reliance on memory only. Further, daily work is dependent on daily news and daily moods, and it cannot emancipate itself from them without running the danger of becoming dry and boring. How much, for instance, would the 4 big volumes of the Marx-Engels correspondence be worth without the 101 contradictions out of which the great general line of their ideas and struggles developed? Even without the great mass of material which is still awaiting resurrection in the columns of the New York Tribune, the main lines of the European policy which Marx and Engels began to adopt with the Crimean War are quite clear today. To a certain extent the adoption of this policy may be said to have marked a turning point in their activities. The authors of the Communist Manifesto and the editors of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung concentrated their main attention on Germany. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung enthusiastically supported the struggle of the Poles, the Italians and the Hungarians for national independence, and in the upshot it demanded war against Russia as the strongest bulwark of European counter-revolution. But later this demand developed more and more into one for a world war against England, because only after the breaking of England's world power would it be possible for the social revolution to emerge from the world of utopia into the world of reality. This Anglo-Russian slavery was the basis on which Marx developed his European policy at the time of the Crimean War. He welcomed the war because it promised to break the European superiority which Tsarism had won as a result of the victory of the counter-revolution in Europe. But he was certainly not in agreement with the fashion in which the Western European powers waged the war. Engels adopted the same attitude and declared that the whole Crimean War was one colossal comedy of errors which made it almost impossible to say from one moment to the next who was the cheater and who the cheated. Despite the million lives and the millions of pounds which the war cost, both Marx and Engels regarded it as a pseudo-war as far as France and, in particular, England were concerned. They were certainly right in so far as neither the false Bonaparte nor Lord Palmerston, the English Foreign Secretary, had any intention of wounding the Russian bear in any vital spot. As soon as they felt convinced that Austria could hold the main forces of the Russian army in check on the western frontiers, they shifted the scene of hostilities to the Crimea, where they battered their heads against the fortress of Sebastopol, succeeding in capturing only half of it after a long drawn-out campaign. In the end they had to satisfy themselves with this one rather dilapidated laurel wreath of victory and beg defeated Russia for permission to evacuate their troops without further interference. It was easy enough to see why the false Bonaparte was unwilling to challenge the Tsar to a life-and-death struggle, but Palmerston's motives were less clear. The continental governments feared him as a revolutionary firebrand, whilst the continental liberals admired him as a paragon of a constitutional liberal minister. Marx solved the riddle by laboriously examining the official blue books and the Hansard reports for the first half of the century and also a number of diplomatic reports which had been deposited in the British Museum. He sought to prove by his search that from the time of Peter the Great down to the opening of the Crimean War there had been secret cooperation between the cabinets in London and St. Petersburg, and that Palmerston in particular was a venal instrument of Tsarist policy. Marx's contentions did not pass without contradiction and they are disputed down to this very day, particularly with regard to the role of Palmerston. There is no doubt that he judged Palmerston's unscrupulous business policy, with its half-measures and its contradictions, much more clearly than did either the European governments or the European liberals, but it does not necessarily result from this that Palmerston had been bought by Russia. However, much more important than the question of whether Marx went too far in his statements or not is the fact that from this time onwards he considered it one of the most indispensable tasks of the working class to probe into the mysteries of international diplomacy in order to counter the diplomatic machinations of the governments or, where this proved impossible, to expose and denounce them. Above all, he was interested in waging an irreconcilable struggle against the barbarous power which had its seat in St. Petersburg and its hand in every European cabinet. He regarded Tsarism not merely as the most powerful bulwark of European reaction whose very passive existence was a permanent threat and danger, but also as the chief enemy whose constant intervention in the affairs of Western Europe hampered and disturbed the normal course of development and aimed at winning geographical footholds which would give it dominance over Europe, thus making the emancipation of the European proletariat impossible. The great stress which he laid on this standpoint greatly influenced his policy from the Crimean War onwards, even more so than during the years of the Revolution. With this he was merely developing an idea he had first expressed in the Neue Rheinische Zeiten. But from now on both for him and for Engels the national struggles of those nations whose cause the paper had championed so enthusiastically began to recede very much into the background. Not that either of them ever ceased to demand the independence of Poland, Hungary and Italy as the right of these countries and the interest of Germany and Europe in general, but as early as 1851, Engels gave his old favourites marching orders. The Italians, Poles and Hungarians must be told plainly that when modern questions are under discussion they must hold their tongues. And a few months later he informed the Poles that they were done for as a nation and useful only as a means to an end until Russia itself had been drawn into the vortex of revolution. The Poles had never done anything in history but act with gallant and quarrelsome stupidity. Even against Russia they had never done anything of historical value, whilst Russia was at least progressive towards the east. With all its baseness and Slav filth, Russian dominance was a civilizing agency for the lands around the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, for Central Asia, Bashkiria, and Tartary. And Russia had absorbed far more cultural and, in particular, industrial elements than Poland, whose nature was essentially Chevalier-esque and slothful. These observations are certainly strongly colored by the passion with which the struggles amongst the exiles were being fought, and in later years Engels' verdict on Poland was much milder. Whilst during the last years of his life he declared that Poland had saved European civilization on at least two occasions, by the Rising in 1792–93 and by the Revolution in 1830–31. Referring to the belauded hero of the Italian Revolution, Marx declared, "Mazzini knows only the towns with their liberal aristocracy and their enlightened citizens. The material needs of the Italian agricultural population, as exploited and as systematically emasculated and held in stupidity as the Irish, are naturally too low for the phraseological heaven of his cosmopolitan, neo-Catholic, ideological manifestos. It needs courage, however, to inform the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy that the first step towards the independence of Italy is the complete emancipation of the peasants and the transformation of their semi-tenant system into free bourgeois property." And in an open letter to his friend Ernest Jones, the Chartist leader, Marx informed Kossuth, who was playing the lion in London, That the European revolutions were crusades of labor against capital and that they could not be depressed to the intellectual and social level of an obscure and semi-barbarous people like the Magyars, who were still stuck in the semi-civilization of the 16th century but actually imagined that they could command the enlightenment of Germany and France and wheedle a cheer from the gullible England. However, Marx developed farthest from the traditions of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung in that he no longer merely concentrated his chief attention on Germany, but actually put it almost completely out of the sphere of his political interests. It is true that at the time Germany played a very sorry role in European politics and could be regarded as little more than a Russian province, but although this more or less explains Marx's attitude, nevertheless both he and Engels were to pay dearly later on for the fact that for a number of years they completely lost touch with developments in Germany. Unfortunately, the contempt which both of them had always felt as Rhinelanders and citizens of an annexed province for the Prussian state was intensified in the days of Manteuffel-Westphalen to such an extent that it fitted ill with their usual keen appreciation of a political situation. The one exception in those days in which Marx did pay attention to conditions in Prussia offers eloquent proof of this. It was towards the end of 1856, when Prussia came into conflict with Switzerland over the Neufchâtel affair. The incident caused Marx, as he wrote to Engels on the 2nd of December, 1856, to supplement his very insufficient knowledge of Prussian history. And he summed up the result of his studies by declaring that world history had never produced anything more lousy. The passages which then follow and an article which appeared a few days later in the People's Paper, a Chartist organ, dealing with the same matter in still greater detail, reveal him as being very far from his usual high level in historical matters. Indeed, he sinks dangerously near to the low level of the scolding petty bourgeois democracy, although it is one of his own particular services that he raised historical writing far above this level. The Prussian state undoubtedly represented a disagreeable morsel for any human being to swallow, but for all that, it was not possible to make it palatable with the caustic mockery of the divine right of the Hohenzollerns. Of the three repeatedly appearing character masks, the pietist, the drill sergeant and the buffoon, of Prussian history as an unappetizing family chronicle, compared with the diabolical epic of Austrian history and with similar observations which at the utmost explain the wherefore, but leave the why of the wherefore completely in the dark.